The chandeliers above the ballroom sparkled so fiercely I almost winced, as if the light itself wanted to remind me I did not belong. My heels struck the marble floor sharp and lonely, while laughter curled through the air like smoke. Everywhere I looked there were sequins and silk golden glasses raised high smiles that seemed painted on for the cameras. And then there was me. I smoothed the thrifted navy dress I had stitched at my tiny kitchen table, pretending for one night it was enough. But the whispers cut deeper than any needle. She doesn't even own a place. She's practically homeless. I caught the glances, the smirks, the cousins lowering their voices, but never low enough. At the center of it all stood my sister Charlotte, radiant in lace, her hand tucked into the arm of a man whose smile was a testament to his wealth. My mother hovered nearby, her pearls glistening like armor, her eyes finding me only to harden. "Sit quietly," she had hissed. "Don't ruin this day." I sat at a table near the service door, the smell of roasted lamb and spilled champagne pressing against me, their laughter rolling over my silence. Inside I burned, remembering every slammed door, every cruel rumor, every night I fought to build a life they refused to see. And then the music broke, the glasses stilled, and the grand doors opened. A man in a dark suit stepped forward holding a leather folder that made my mother's face turn white. My pulse thundered as his voice carried across the hall, and in that instant I knew nothing in this family would ever be the same again. The chandeliers above the ballroom sparkled so brightly I had to squint when I stepped inside. My heels clicked against the polished marble floor as the hum of laughter and clinking glasses washed over me. The Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Boston was draped in gold and ivory, every corner smelling faintly of roses and expensive champagne. From the balcony windows, you could see the public garden lit up against the autumn night. It was the kind of wedding that cost hundreds of thousands, the kind of spectacle my sister Charlotte always dreamed of. I tugged gently at the hem of my navy dress. I had found it at a thrift store 2 weeks earlier, tailored it myself, and convinced my reflection it was good enough. The fabric was smooth and decent, but under the crystal lights, it looked plain compared to the sequins and silk gowns swirling past me. I caught a whisper as I passed a group of cousins near the coat check. "She doesn't even have a real place in Dorchester," one muttered. I heard another snicker. "She's probably still living out of that rundown unit in South Boston, practically homeless." The words stung sharp as glass. My breath hitched, but I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. For a moment I saw again the nights in my tiny apartment, the radiator clanking, while I sat editing articles at 2 a.m. telling myself independence was worth the loneliness. They would never understand that. They didn't want to. I straightened my back and moved deeper into the ballroom. Every table gleamed with gold chargers and crystal flutes. A string quartet played near the stage, their bows gliding in perfect rhythm. Guests in tuxedos leaned close to aldermen, lawyers, and business owners. Charlotte and my mother Linda had curated every detail to impress Boston's elite. I walked toward the far side of the room and caught my mother's gaze. She stood near the champagne fountain in a silver gown, pearls glowing against her throat. Her lips barely moved as I approached. "Do not cause a scene, Anna. Sit quietly. Do not ruin Charlotte's day." Her voice was ice. I swallowed hard, the bitter taste of old wounds flooding back. I nodded, because arguing here would be pointless. She turned away before I even sat down. The seat they had assigned me was at a small table near the service door. I lowered myself into the chair, pressing my hands together under the tablecloth. Laughter from the main tables rolled toward me like waves. Charlotte glided across the room in her lace gown, radiant, trailed by a photographer capturing every angle. Her friends raised glasses to her beauty and her ambition. Not one glance came my way. I traced the rim of my water glass, listening to the chatter bounce around the hall. A cousin bragged about his firm's latest merger. An uncle toasted to Charlotte marrying into money. Every word carried the same undertone: success, wealth, appearances. They had all convinced themselves I was the opposite. A failure. A cautionary tale. At 34, I had built my life as a freelance writer and editor, piecing together gigs that paid the bills without anyone's help. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I let the sting fade into resolve. They were unaware of the full story. They did not know that beneath their staged perfection, truth was waiting to surface. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne. I took a flute and held it loosely. My heart pounded as I sipped, letting the bubbles burn my throat. Around me, the guests rose, lifting their glasses as the music swelled. Charlotte's groom clinked his knife against a glass, calling for attention. "To Charlotte and to the future," he said. Voices echoed the toast. Glasses collided. And just as the sound filled the ballroom, the grand doors creaked open. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, his presence cutting through the glow and laughter like a sudden draft. My pulse quickened as he started walking toward the front. He walked with steady steps, his shoes echoing across the marble, and though the music had not stopped, the chatter in the ballroom softened. My chest tightened. I knew who he was even from a distance. George Kaplan, my grandfather's attorney. The man who carried the weight of secrets no one else in this room even suspected. As he made his way toward the stage, a rush of memories pressed in. It was as if the gleam of the chandeliers blurred into other lights, softer ones from long ago. I was 12 again, standing in the hallway of our Beacon Hill townhouse, listening to my mother fuss over Charlotte's new ballet shoes. Charlotte twirled blonde curls, bouncing, while I clutched a stack of library books. My mother's voice was warm for her, clipped for me. Charlotte was destined, she said, to shine. I was reminded to be quiet, to stay out of the way. The sound of laughter in the present jolted me back, but the ache from those years never really left. Charlotte's birthdays were grand affairs at steakhouses in Back Bay. Cakes taller than she was, a string of guests applauding every smile. Mine were afterthoughts, a cupcake left on the counter if I was lucky. I remembered my college graduation more vividly than I wanted to. I had done the impossible, earned a full scholarship to Harvard. I searched the crowd that day, scanning rows of parents with bouquets, with cameras, with tears of pride. There was no one for me. My family had skipped it. My mother claimed she was busy planning Charlotte's first modeling shoot, a contract so small it barely paid for a week's groceries. But for them, it was reason enough to celebrate. The ache tightened into something sharper when I thought about my father. He had been the only buffer, quiet but steady. When he died in 2018, it was as if the last thread tying me to that family snapped. Within months, my mother and Charlotte sat me down in the living room of the old townhouse. They told me I should leave, that I wasn't contributing, that after losing my first long-term writing job, I was a burden. My father's leather chair still smelled of him, but his absence meant I had no defense. I packed my boxes and left with tears burning my throat, listening to the lock click behind me as though I had never belonged. South Boston became my refuge, a cramped apartment with a crooked radiator and a window that leaked every winter. I worked part-time at a bookstore, piecing together freelance editing jobs at night. The neighbors barely noticed me, but whispers carried. Soon enough, my own relatives painted me as homeless, astray, drifting between odd jobs. It was cruel, but also convenient for them. It covered the truth that I was surviving without their wealth, without their help. I asked myself again and again why a mother would choose one daughter so completely over the other. Some nights I would stare at the ceiling and whisper into the dark, "I am your daughter too. Why do you treat me like a stranger?" Then came the visits with my grandfather. Thomas Whitmore was old, sharp-eyed, and far less blind to the cruelty in his family than he pretended. We sat together in his study on Tremont Street, the smell of pipe tobacco lingering. He told me quietly that he had seen what was happening, that he knew the way Linda and Charlotte schemed. He warned me about Henry Lawson, a businessman who circled our family like a vulture, offering investments that always seemed to benefit only him and my mother. My grandfather called him a partner in shadows. Those meetings were the first time I felt someone in the family truly believed me, truly saw me. He urged me to hold on, to keep records of my work and my life, to stand firm. He said the time would come when the truth would matter more than appearances. George Kaplan had been there once, a gray-suited figure listening silently as my grandfather gave instructions. After my grandfather died in 2020, George was the one who kept in touch. His letters were brief, his words careful, but they carried a promise. When the moment was right, the family would hear what they had tried so hard to bury. Now that promise was walking across the ballroom floor, past the crystal centerpieces and the gilded chairs. I gripped my glass tighter, the chill of it anchoring me as I fought the swirl of old hurt rising with each step he took. Around me, the guests leaned in curious. Charlotte's laughter faltered, her eyes flicking toward him with confusion. My mother's smile froze like glass. George reached the front, nodded once to the band, and cleared his throat. The music trailed into silence. The room seemed to tilt, and I drew a sharp breath. I knew the past I had carried alone was about to spill into the light. George placed a leather folder on the podium and looked out at the sea of tuxedos and glittering gowns. His voice cut through the stillness, calm but unyielding, as he asked the room for silence. The quartet lowered their instruments, waiters froze with trays of champagne midair. Even the laughter that had bubbled only moments before faded into a sharp, uneasy hush. I could feel every eye in that ballroom dart between him, my sister, in her lace gown, and me at the back corner table. Charlotte's smile faltered. Her groom leaned in to whisper, but she shook her head quickly. My mother's hand tightened around her glass until her knuckles whitened. George opened the folder and unfolded a sheet of thick paper, yellowed slightly at the edges but still crisp. His words carried weight. He said he was acting under instructions given by my grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, whose estate had been probated, but whose final wishes included a public reading at the first significant family gathering. And tonight, this wedding was it. My heart slammed in my chest. I could hear my own breath as he began to read. The letter was in my grandfather's handwriting, firm and deliberate. He spoke of legacy, of the rot that seeps in when appearances matter more than values. Then the words shifted sharper as he named the heir to his estate. Not Charlotte, not Linda, me. Gasps broke out across the room. A fork clattered against porcelain. I sat frozen as he listed what was mine, the Beacon Hill townhouse my father once lived in, the small property company managing rentals across Dorchester, and a carefully tended investment fund. Together worth millions. My pulse roared in my ears. My grandfather's words dug deep. He wrote that the one mocked as homeless was in truth the only one who had shown the spirit of family, the only one he trusted to carry the name forward. The ballroom erupted in whispers. Phones lifted screens glowing as guests recorded every word. Charlotte's face drained of color. She tried to laugh, but it came out brittle, almost a choke. My mother leaned forward, eyes burning into George, her voice slicing the quiet. This is absurd. This is a fabrication. She has orchestrated this spectacle to humiliate us. But George held up the folder again. His expression was steady, almost weary, as if he had known this reaction was inevitable. He announced that the document had been filed with the Suffolk County Probate Court, verified and sealed. He said he carried certified copies, notarized and binding. He paused long enough for the truth to settle over the room. Charlotte stumbled forward, veil quivering, her hand clutching at the groom's arm. She cried out that I had always been jealous, that I was stealing what never belonged to me. Her groom shifted uncomfortably, his smile gone, uncertainty flickering across his face. I sat rigid, every muscle taut, 100 eyes on me. The humiliation I had borne for years mixed with a trembling sense of vindication. My grandfather had chosen me. He had said so plainly publicly, where no one could twist his words. I saw my mother's lips moving quickly to the guests nearest her, trying to explain, to diminish, to redirect their stares. But George did not falter. He lifted the letter once more, reading a final line that made the room shiver. The house belongs to the one you all dismissed. The roof you laughed at her for lacking will now be the roof over you should you ever need shelter. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at me with something new in their eyes, not pity, but recognition. I could barely breathe. My hands trembled beneath the table as I clutched the stem of my glass. For a moment, everything blurred: the chandeliers above the roses, the glittering dresses. Then I felt clarity cut through. The lies, the cruelty, the years of silence were unraveling here in front of everyone. Linda pushed her chair back and Rose's silver gown rustling. She marched toward the podium, her voice cold and furious. She demanded that George stop, that he hand over the letter, that he explain himself. But George reached calmly into his folder again. He pulled out another document, this one stamped with the court's seal. The sight of it made my mother freeze mid-step. The room held its breath. I knew whatever came next would tear away the last defense they had. Linda broke the silence first. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she stormed toward the podium, her pearl necklace trembling against her throat. She raised a trembling hand and pointed at George, her voice slicing through the room. "This is a forgery. How dare you come here and ruin my daughter's wedding with lies?" Charlotte's sobs rose behind her. She clutched her groom's arm, mascara streaking her cheeks. "It should be mine. It was always supposed to be mine. Anna has been jealous of me her whole life." She practically screamed the words, her voice cracking under the weight of them. Guests gasped, some shifting in their seats, while others whispered to each other. I caught fragments. Anna planned this. She waited for tonight. Revenge. My throat burned, but I stayed frozen in my chair, every nerve tight. It was the same accusation they had thrown at me for years, only now, in front of hundreds of witnesses. For a heartbeat, I wondered if anyone here would believe them. George did not flinch. He adjusted his glasses, his tone calm, steady, almost paternal. He explained that the original will was held by the Massachusetts Probate and Family Court, where it had been filed and verified in 2021. He said probate had been completed, but certain conditions delayed distribution until this public reading. His words were methodical, leaving no room for doubt. Linda tried to speak again, but George raised his hand and pressed a button on the small laptop placed on the podium. The large screen behind him flickered, and suddenly my grandfather's voice filled the ballroom. I recognized the study instantly, the dark oak shelves and the brass lamp on his desk. My grandfather sat there, thinner than I remembered, but sharp, reading from the very letter George had just delivered. A notary sat at his side, confirming every page as authentic. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Someone near me muttered that it could not be faked, not with a notary present, not with the court seal. Linda staggered back a step, her silver gown brushing the edge of the podium. Charlotte shook her head wildly, tears dripping onto her lace sleeves. Her groom slowly let go of her hand, his eyes narrowing as if a veil had lifted and he was finally seeing the cracks. The recording ended, leaving only the hum of the air vents and the faint rustle of dresses against chairs. My pulse thudded in my ears. For the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar rising inside me. Not shame, not silence. Vindication. My grandfather had spoken the truth himself, and no one could twist it. I wanted to stand, to scream at all of them that this was justice, that their cruelty was no longer hidden. Instead, I sat still, my fingers pressed into the tablecloth, breathing through the trembling in my chest. Linda found her voice again, but it had lost its command. She turned toward the guests closest to her, insisting the will must have been manipulated, that Anna had tricked George, that it was all part of some elaborate scheme. But the murmurs no longer belonged to her. They rippled with doubt, with curiosity, with something that sounded like disbelief. Charlotte collapsed into her chair, covering her face with her hands. Her groom whispered something sharp into her ear, and she jerked away, shaking her head violently. The photographer who had followed her all night lowered his camera, uncertain whether to capture what was now unfolding. I sat rooted, my body buzzing with adrenaline. At last, the people who had turned my life into a shadow were watching their facade crack. George let the silence stretch, then reached for the folder once more. His expression tightened. He said there was one more clause in the will, one condition my grandfather insisted on, before the estate could be fully transferred. Linda's laugh was sudden, brittle, cutting through the air. She folded her arms across her chest and looked directly at me, her smile sharp as glass. Of course there is. Let's see if you can pass it, Anna. The room shifted again, every gaze swinging back toward the podium. My stomach clenched, the surge of triumph I had felt collapsing into a knot of fear. Whatever came next was about to decide everything. George adjusted his glasses and read on his tone, deliberate. My grandfather's letter carried one final hurdle. The heir must prove independent residence a lawful home not tied to family support to show they were capable of managing the estate. A ripple of relief and malice ran through the room at once. My mother laughed, first sharp and cutting. She turned so her voice carried. She only has that shabby rental in Dorchester. That is no home. She is practically homeless. The crowd stirred, whispers multiplying like fire. I felt dozens of eyes on me, measuring me against the word homeless, feeding on the humiliation they wanted so badly to stick. My palms pressed into the table, but I forced myself to rise. I reached into my bag and pulled out a slim folder. My hands no longer shook. I walked toward the aisle, each step echoing louder than the quartet that had long since fallen silent. When I opened the folder, the pages gleamed white under the chandeliers. I handed them to George. He scanned the first page, then lifted his gaze to the audience. This is a deed. A condominium in Dorchester purchased in 2022, owned outright by Anna Miller. The room froze. He continued. It was bought with compensation from a workplace discrimination settlement. Mortgage satisfied. Records verified with the bank. A hush spread like a blanket. The murmurs died. My sister collapsed into her chair, her veil sliding from her shoulder. My mother's face drained of color, her lips parting as if words might come, but none did. I exhaled slowly, steadying my chest. For 3 years, I had lived quietly in that condo, making every payment, furnishing every corner myself, surviving without their handouts. They had painted me as a wanderer, but I had built something with my own hands. Guests shifted uncomfortably now. Some avoided my eyes, others looked at me differently, as if the caricature they had been fed no longer fit. A woman across the aisle mouthed something like, "Good for you," though she quickly turned back when she noticed Linda's glare. George spoke again. "The condition has been met. The estate stands to transfer." My throat tightened with the force of it. For so long I had dreamed of the day their lies would unravel. Now it was here, and I stood breathing in the stunned silence of people who had once mocked me. My mother tried again, desperate. "This must be fabricated," she said, her voice too shrill, too thin. Charlotte sobbed into her hands, unable to look at me, as if my existence had become unbearable in the space of minutes. I thought of the nights I had spent alone with only my laptop glow, stitching together edits to pay for groceries, every penny set aside until I could sign my own deed. I remembered the fear, the doubt, the nights when I nearly believed their story about me. And now, standing in the ballroom, drenched in gold, I realized I had beaten them without raising my voice. George closed the folder gently. Then he reached down and lifted a small steel box from beneath the podium. Its surface reflected the chandeliers. He rested it on the table, his hand steady. "There is one more matter," he said. "Instructions left by Thomas Whitmore himself." The weight of the box seemed to pulse through the room. My pulse quickened again. Whatever lay inside was more than a formality. I knew it the moment I saw the way my mother stiffened, the way Charlotte finally lifted her head with wide, terrified eyes. George set the steel box on the podium, with deliberate care, the sound of metal against wood carrying through the hall. He unlocked it with a small key and pulled out a flash drive sealed inside an envelope stamped with the bank's insignia. The murmur of the guests grew restless like a storm about to break. My breath caught in my throat as he inserted the drive into his laptop and turned toward the projection screen that hung above the stage. The ballroom dimmed as the screen lit up. A voice crackled through the speakers, unmistakably my mother's. She was speaking quickly, sharp, and commanding. "We cannot let Anna have any claim. Transfer the assets. Use the Delaware Corporation." Another voice answered, calmer, but edged with satisfaction. "Charlotte." Her tone was nothing like the sobs she had offered minutes ago. "We will file it under Langley Holdings. No one will trace it back." Gasps rippled across the tables. Guests leaned forward, whispering to one another. My stomach twisted, but I could not look away. Then a third sound joined a low chuckle that made the hairs on my arms rise. I knew that laugh. So did many others. A man at the front row stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "That's Henry Lawson," he said loudly enough for half the room to hear. "He was investigated in Boston for fraud 5 years ago." The whispers became a roar. My mother's face drained of blood, her lips pressed tight. Charlotte shook her head violently, mouthing that it was not real, that it was fabricated. But the voices on the recording kept going. Linda's words were merciless. "Thomas is gone. The court only knows what we give them. We can bury Anna's name forever." Henry's laugh cut through again, smug and knowing. "Leave it to me. Delaware is a perfect shield." The recording ended abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. It was not the celebratory quiet of a wedding toast, but the strained pause of a courtroom where guilt hung in the air. I glanced around the ballroom. Men in tuxedos whispered to their wives. A city councilman who had been laughing at me earlier now frowned deeply, clearly calculating how this scandal would reflect on him if he stayed. 2 women in designer gowns stood quickly, muttering that they had to leave, their heels clicking as they hurried toward the exit. It felt surreal watching their empire of lies unravel in front of people they had worked so hard to impress. My chest swelled with something fierce and steady. They will pay for every word they ever used to break me, I thought. Linda lunged toward the podium, shouting that the audio was spliced, that someone had staged it. But George calmly held up the bank's notarized seal again. This was entrusted directly by Thomas Whitmore, authenticated and preserved. Charlotte's groom had been silent until now. His jaw tightened, his face pale under the golden light. He pulled his arm from her grip. His voice trembled, not with nerves but with disgust. "What is this, Charlotte? Were you planning to drag me into this scheme too?" She shook her head frantically, grabbing for him, her veil slipping from her hair. "No, it isn't true, I swear." But the damage was done. The crowd had shifted. No one was laughing anymore. They were witnessing something raw, the peeling away of masks that had glittered for too long. I stood in the corner, my pulse even now racing. But for once, it was not fear. It was vindication. For years I had been the shadow, the forgotten daughter. Tonight the truth was blazing, in lights too bright to ignore. The ballroom doors slammed as another group of guests left, their voices echoing down the corridor. The wedding had turned into a tribunal, and everyone knew it. Charlotte's sobs grew louder, her mascara streaking down her face. She looked at her groom with wide, desperate eyes, but he would not meet her gaze. He stepped back, leaving her alone at the center of the chaos. I could feel the weight of the moment settling, pressing toward something bigger. My mother was not finished, and neither was Charlotte. And the man who had just turned away from my sister was about to decide whether their world would collapse completely. Richard's jaw clenched as he stared at Charlotte, his shoulders rising with each breath. Then, with a sudden motion, he pulled the gold band from his finger and hurled it against the marble floor. The clang echoed like a gavel striking in judgment. Gasps swept across the ballroom. "I will not marry into a family of liars!" he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. His father built his empire on integrity. "You expect me to walk into this mess with open eyes? Never!" Charlotte staggered forward, grabbing at his sleeve. "Please, Richard, you don't understand. It's not what it looks like." He pulled away, his face cold, and turned toward the doors. Cameras flashed as guests lifted their phones, capturing every second. The sound of typing and buzzing notifications filled the room. George cleared his throat and lifted another document from the steel box. The crowd hushed as he held it high. These, he explained, were email records showing attempted forgeries of bank authorizations, digital signatures traced to Linda's account. The files had already been submitted to the probate system for verification. My mother swayed on her heels, her hand clutching the podium for balance. Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked older than I had ever seen her, drained of the polish she always carried. George did not stop. He announced that the district attorney's office had been notified in advance, given the likelihood of fraud. At that signal, 2 uniformed officers, who had been standing discreetly near the back, stepped forward. Their presence drew a collective gasp. One officer addressed the room firmly. "This matter is now under investigation. While no arrests will be made tonight, the assets in question are subject to immediate freeze pending review. The ballroom erupted. Chairs scraped heels, clattered voices rose in disbelief. Some guests scrambled for the exits, others stayed rooted to their seats, hungry to watch the downfall unfold. Phones were raised higher now, live streams broadcasting the chaos beyond the gilded walls. On the screen above the stage, hashtags began to appear in real time as people posted clips online. Miller wedding scandal, Boston fraud. Within minutes, the event had transformed from celebration to spectacle, feeding a city's appetite for gossip. Charlotte collapsed into her chair, her gown spilling around her like a crumpled curtain. Her sobs were raw, but no one moved to comfort her. Even her bridesmaids looked away, whispering among themselves, their faces pale. Linda stood frozen, her eyes darting from one officer to another, searching for an escape that no longer existed. The crowd had turned. Former allies avoided her gaze, some already slipping out the doors to protect their reputations. I sat still for a moment, letting the wave wash over me. The humiliation they had crafted for me all these years was now theirs. I felt my shoulders lift as I finally rose from my chair. My steps were quiet, steady, carrying me past the tables where cousins had once laughed about my supposed failures. None of them dared meet my eyes now. The chandeliers glittered overhead, their light no longer mocking but illuminating. For the first time in this family's orbit, I did not feel small. I felt unshackled. As I reached the ballroom doors, the noise swelled behind me. Guests argued, reporters shouted questions, phones buzzed with updates. I paused just long enough to glance back. Charlotte hunched in her chair, veil crumpled in her lap, Linda gripping the podium like a shipwrecked passenger clinging to driftwood. I turned away, stepping into the cool corridor. Each breath tasted like freedom. Each stride carried me farther from the weight of their scorn. But even as I walked out of that glittering ruin, I knew this was only the beginning. What happened tonight would not end in whispers or hashtags. It would end in courtrooms, in verdicts, in the full light of justice. And in the months ahead, the truth would rise higher than any chandelier in that cursed ballroom. By January, the snow had settled thick over the streets of Boston, softening the city's edges, but doing nothing to quiet the storm that had torn through my family. I stood outside the probate and family court, my boots crunching in the frost, as George Kaplan handed me the final order. It was official now. The estate was mine. The Beacon Hill townhouse, the rental company in Dorchester, the investment accounts. Everything my grandfather had fought to protect had come into my hands. Inside the courthouse, my mother and sister had sat pale and silent while the judge confirmed the findings. Fraudulent transfers, shell companies in Delaware, falsified bank documents. Linda's career as an attorney was over the firm she had worked at for 2 decades, dropping her the morning the ruling hit the news. Charlotte's modeling agency cut ties within days, sponsors erasing her face from campaigns as if she had never existed. I should have felt triumph, but what settled in my chest was something steadier. Justice. I walked through the old townhouse in Beacon Hill the following week, my footsteps echoing against hardwood floors, polished by generations. I ran my hand along the banister and whispered to my grandfather that I would not waste what he had entrusted to me. The house no longer felt like a fortress of exclusion. I decided to open its doors. With the help of Rosie's Place, a local women's shelter, I began the process of turning the townhouse into Haven House, a center for women without homes, women who knew the same sting of being dismissed and forgotten. Contractors filled the halls with the smell of fresh paint and sawdust. But beneath it all, I felt the pulse of something alive, something healing. Reporters came, their cameras trailing through rooms that once held only family portraits. On the front steps of the house, I told the Boston Globe that my family had called me homeless. Now I would give homes to those who truly needed them. Justice was not only about retribution, it was about restoration. The story spread quickly. Articles appeared across the country. Videos of the wedding scandal circulated alongside photos of me cutting a ribbon at the Haven House entrance. Messages poured in from women who had felt the same rejection I once carried like a weight on my back. They told me that watching me stand in that ballroom had given them courage. At night, when the workers left and the halls fell quiet, I sat in the parlor with a cup of tea. Through the windows, I could see the city glowing in the snow. I thought of all the nights I had sat alone in my South Boston apartment, convincing myself that survival was enough. Now I knew it had only been the beginning. Charlotte tried once to call me. I saw her name flash on my phone and let it ring until it stopped. Some wounds were too deep, and forgiveness could not erase the choices she had made. Linda sent a letter through her attorney filled with words about misunderstandings and mistakes. I folded it once and placed it in a drawer I never planned to open again. What mattered was the laughter beginning to echo in these rooms again, not from shallow parties, but from women finding safety and purpose. I walked through the halls with volunteers showing them where bedrooms would be, where a kitchen would feed dozens, where a study would hold computers for job searches. The house was no longer a symbol of exclusion. It was a promise. Standing in the entryway one evening, I touched the doorframe and breathed in the warmth rising from the radiators. I no longer carried the word homeless like a scar. I carried it like a banner turned inside out, a reminder that I had built my own shelter long before anyone recognized it. If you have ever been cast aside or silenced in your own family, know this. Truth has a way of surfacing. Justice may hide for years, but when it rises, it can change everything. Tell me in the comments if you have ever carried a story like mine. I want to hear it, and others who listen here need to hear it too.